Rayon had always felt at home in the forest. As a seasoned forest ranger, he knew every trail, every hidden nook, and every whisper the trees made when the wind cut through them just right. He'd guided countless hikers through treacherous terrain, rescued the lost, and faced dangers most people only read about in survival books. There were stories he'd tell around campfires, like the time he'd evaded a pack of wolves by climbing a towering pine, or the day he'd been saved from a bear by sheer luck and quick thinking. But those were just tales any forest worker might have. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Rayon received a call that would change everything. A tourist had gone missing deep within the forest. The authorities had already been searching for hours, but the dense woods and rugged terrain made the search difficult. Rayon's experience and expertise were called upon once again, and this time he was joined by his trusted partner, Jim. Jim was as seasoned as Rayon, a solid companion who knew the forest as well as he did. They had shared many adventures together, and both had an unspoken bond that made them an excellent team. The two men met at the ranger station where they were briefed on the missing tourist, a man named Daniel Thompson, who had gone out for a hike earlier that day and had not returned. The picture they were given showed a man in his mid-30s, with short dark hair, a rugged beard, and a pair of worn hiking boots. His eyes in the photo were bright, full of life and excitement, a stark contrast to the look he would have after spending hours lost in the forest. "We need to move fast," Jim said, tightening the straps on his backpack. "The sun's almost gone, and it's going to get a lot harder to find him in the dark." Rayon nodded, adjusting his own gear. "We'll cover more ground if we split up. Keep in touch over the walkie-talkies. We'll rendezvous back at the car in 2 hours." Jim agreed, and the two men set off in opposite directions, their flashlights slicing through the growing darkness. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. The deeper Rayon went, the more he felt the weight of the woods around him, an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow even the sound of his footsteps. As the minutes turned into hours, Rayon began to wonder if they would find Daniel at all. The forest was vast, and even someone with his experience could easily miss a person hiding or unconscious beneath the thick underbrush. His walkie-talkie crackled to life, startling him out of his thoughts. "Rayon, anything on your end?" Jim's voice came through, slightly distorted by static. "Nothing yet," Rayon replied, scanning the area with his flashlight. "How about you?" "Not a sign. We might have to call in more help if we don't find him soon." Rayon was about to respond when something caught his eye. A figure standing still in the distance, partially obscured by the trees. His heart skipped a beat. It was a man, dirty and disheveled, his clothes torn and his body hunched as if he were trying to make himself small. Rayon's grip on his flashlight tightened as he took a cautious step forward. "Daniel Thompson?" he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the silence. The man didn't move. He stood there, staring at Rayon with wide, frightened eyes. The light from Rayon's flashlight illuminated the man's face, and there was no doubt about it. It was the same man from the photo. But something was wrong. His eyes, there was something off about them, something that made Rayon's skin crawl. They were too wide, too focused, as if the man were seeing something that wasn't there. "It's okay," Rayon said gently, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm here to help you. Let's get you back to the car, and we'll get you out of here." The man remained silent, his gaze locked on Rayon. For a moment, Rayon wondered if the man was in shock, too terrified to speak. He took a deep breath and approached slowly, extending his hand. The man's movements were strange, jerky, and uncoordinated, as if he were unfamiliar with his own body. He didn't respond to Rayon's words, didn't seem to understand them. "You don't have to talk now," Rayon said, trying to maintain a reassuring tone. "Just come with me." He gently took the man's hand and began to lead him back toward the car, but as they walked, a growing unease gnawed at Rayon's mind. The man's skin was cold, almost unnaturally so, and his hand in Rayon's felt wrong. Too smooth, too soft for someone who had been lost in the forest for hours. And then there were his movements, those strange, unsettling movements that didn't seem human. Finally, they reached the car. Rayon opened the passenger door and helped the man inside. The stranger sat there, his hands resting awkwardly in his lap, staring straight ahead. Rayon felt a shiver run down his spine as he closed the door, his fingers trembling slightly. He needed to contact Jim to let him know that he had found the missing hiker. He reached for his walkie-talkie, but before he could speak, Jim's voice crackled through the speaker.
"Rayon, I found him. He's okay. We're heading back to the car now."
Rayon froze, his blood running cold. He stared at the walkie-talkie, unable to comprehend what he had just heard. What do you mean you found him?" he stammered.
"I found Daniel Thompson."
Jim replied, a hint of confusion in his voice.
"He looks just like the picture. Why do you ask?"
Rayon turned slowly to look at the man in the car. He was still sitting there, but something had changed. His head was tilted at an odd angle, and his mouth was twisted into a grin that didn't reach his eyes that now seemed to reflect something dark, something sinister. "Jim," Rayon's voice was barely a whisper, "are you sure it's the right guy?"
"Yeah, I'm sure,"
Jim replied, his tone growing more concerned.
"What's going on?"
Rayon couldn't answer. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the impossible. Two identical men, both lost in the same forest, both found at the same time. But that wasn't the worst of it. The man in the car was no longer just sitting there. He was laughing, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down Rayon's spine. The sound was wrong, too deep, too inhuman. Rayon's instincts screamed at him to get away, to run as fast as he could. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he pressed the button to lock the car doors. The laughter stopped abruptly, and when Rayon dared to look back, the man's face had changed again. It was his own face now, staring back at him from the darkness of the car, a twisted mockery of his features. Panicking, Rayon turned and ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the forest. He could hear Jim's voice over the walkie-talkie, but it was distant, drowned out by the pounding of his heart. He had to reach Jim, had to tell him what he had seen, but what would he say? How could he explain the impossible? The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees towering over him like silent sentinels. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Rayon saw the beam of a flashlight cutting through the darkness. He stumbled toward it, his legs feeling like lead. Jim emerged from the shadows, the real Daniel Thompson by his side. This man's movements were more natural, more human, but there was still a wariness in his eyes, a fear that had not been there before. "Rayon, what happened?" Jim asked, his voice urgent. Rayon could barely catch his breath. I found him. The other one. He looked like me." Jim's face paled, his eyes widening with realization. "You locked him in the car?" Rayon nodded, unable to speak. Jim cursed under his breath, his expression one of fear and anger. "We need to get out of here now," Jim said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You have no idea what you've done." What was it?" Rayon asked, his voice trembling. Jim hesitated, glancing at Daniel, who looked just as confused and frightened as Rayon felt. "It's a skinwalker," Jim finally said. "A forest spirit that takes people into the woods, mimics their form, and then kills them. It preys on those who are lost and weak, and once it takes your shape, it can fool anyone, even you." Rayon felt his stomach turn. "So, it's still out there, looking like me?" "Not for long," Jim said, his voice grim. "We need to leave before it finds us again. The car won't hold it for long." They hurried back to the car, but when they arrived, the vehicle was empty. The figure that had once sat inside was gone, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. Rayon felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. They got into the car without another word, and Jim drove them away from the forest as fast as the winding roads would allow. The drive back was silent, each man lost in his thoughts. Rayon couldn't shake the image of that thing wearing his face, mocking him with its twisted smile. He glanced at Jim, who was focused on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Jim," Rayon began, breaking the silence. "How do you know about these things? How many have you seen?" Jim didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I've seen one before. Years ago. It took my brother's form. By the time I realized it wasn't him, it was too late." Rayon felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know what to say, how to respond to such a revelation. The forest, which had once been his sanctuary, now felt like a place of dread, a place where things that shouldn't exist lurked in the shadows.